Hi, everyone. On today's show, we have a special guest, an interview segment. It's Adam Rosen, curator of the Vintage Mac Museum and writer for cultofmac.com. He also writes for his own blog at vintagemacmuseum.com and for lowendmac.com. His day job is as an IT consultant, specializing in new and old Apple Macintosh systems at Oakbog Professional Services in Boston. Go to oakbog.com. Hi, Adam. Welcome to the show.
Hi, David, and guys. Glad to be with you.
This is the segment where we're going to pick on somebody who really helps contribute to vintage Mac culture. Tear them down.
And it's 3 against 1. That's what always makes it more fun.
That makes it a fair fight, right?
So, Adam, obviously, this is sort of a new segment to the show, and we don't have a lot of experience with it. So, I guess I'll just jump into some questions. So, we did come up with a few questions for you. Or actually, is there anything more you'd like to tell us about yourself?
Well, you guys have probably heard of me through either the Vintage Mac Museum or Cult of Mac. The Vintage Mac Museum is actually the longer running of the two, and in fact was how I originally got to know Leander at Cult of Mac.
Mm-hmm.
I've been a Macintosh user since college, and for about 1986 or so, just about after the Mac came out, and I've had my collection since about 1999, 2000. And what started as a personal collection has grown to become both part of my business, part of my Mac consulting business, and led to other connections like writing on vintage Mac technologies for Cult of Mac. Leander had written up a little segment on my museum for Macworld in 2004 when I was briefly back in Boston. So then I get to talk to other, it's been interesting because it leads me to other things like talking to the famed Retro Computing Roundtable.
And you run the Oakbog Professional Services. So that's what you do for a living. That's
correct. I'm a Macintosh consultant, and the bulk of my time is supporting current systems and getting people's email working and software upgrades and that sort of stuff.
Okay. And then you have the museum as part of your office, sort of like in the lobby, perhaps, or the sitting area of the business?
That, in my mind, that's what it will ultimately be. My office and the museum are both in my home. So I have a room downstairs that I use in my office that now has some equipment in it that has spilled over from, I've dedicated a bedroom to the collection, and that is full. And there's stuff in the attic and stuff in the storage closet, and, it just never seems to stop growing.
Well, Adam, I appreciate you being on the show today. With that extensive collection of Macs, I was curious. There were a lot of Macs produced even in the pre-1995 era. And of those, I'm wondering, do you have a favorite?
That's a hard question to answer because I can never come up with a single model. I have favorites, which is basically what my museum is. It's not comprehensive. It's more best of breed. But I think if I had to narrow it down to just one, so pre-95 would be the first generation, the 68K Macintosh era. And I would say the PowerBook 540C, because it was a very powerful computer as a portable, stereo sound, full floating point processing and all of that. Basically the last line of Apple's classic 68K before they switched to PowerPC. And it was such a beautiful system for its day with the trackpad and the design of it, and it really influenced Apple's design and other companies' design, for a decade to come. I had a great lust after that system when it was new and I couldn't afford it. And now that I can get them for $50 a piece, I have several in my collection.
I wouldn't actually mind having one of those. At the time that came out, I was working for a company that was, kind of bucking the trend of the day, and they had standardized on Macintosh rather than on PC. And so I had a 540C as my main machine, and I really loved it. I agree with you. Those were beautiful.
Yeah, and that whole series, I think it started with the 520, right? Was that like the first one maybe? But the 500 series, you're right, that introduced the trackpad, I think, to maybe some rare exception, but mainstream-wise, to the entire industry. That defined what laptops, basically should look like afterwards. Apple had already defined pushing the keyboard back or, up and creating palm rests and then having the trackball in the middle. And that was the next logical sort of expansion of that, I guess, plus having the stereo speakers and such. I think, right, Adam?
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. It was new in the trackpad. That was the introduction of it. And the 520 and the 540 actually came out at the same time.
Mm.
The difference was the 520 had a passive matrix.
Oh, yeah.
And the 540 had an active matrix, which for the day was the much better color technology.
It was beautiful. I remember just being staggered looking at that display. I mean, for the day and time, it was awesome. So you mentioned that you just tend to collect the things that are your personal favorites. I can relate to that. I kind of do the same thing, and also was curious. It's not just the computers. Obviously, it's the software that tends to be the things that you remember. And I was wondering, what kind of programs do you find that you collect or find interesting on the old Macs? I mean, are you a gamer? Is it productivity apps, programming? What sort of software, and maybe even books too, do you collect?
I agree with you on that point. In fact, it's actually a quick one point that my collection is not just what I personally like, although that's the bulk of it, but it's the models I felt were the best or most significant in the Macintosh lineup. So I have actually added some over the years that I didn't originally have after coming to appreciate it more. But in response to your question, two things. The software actually is the more interesting part, especially because so many old computers aren't even running, so you just see the industrial design. The museum started because I wanted to compare the original Macintosh system software, System 0 or System 1, whatever you'd call it, with OS 10 when it first came out in 2000.
Mm.
And I got a Mac Plus and downloaded a floppy disk image of, first early systems, and had that one side of a table and my, whatever the Power Mac at the time was, with OS 10, 10.0 at the other side, and was looking at how much had changed, how much was different, in this 20-year span of the operating system. And the collections, the systems that I have in the collection, most of them work. As many of them that I can get, to work are working. The two things I use on them, one is watching the evolution of the Macintosh system software and how that has changed over time, and what was added when, and what went away, and what used to be better. Frankly, the Finder was better in OS 9 than it's ever been in OS 10, with some exceptions. The other thing that I use regularly and appreciate are the productivity apps, Word, Excel, MacWrite, that kind of stuff, both for appreciating them and for them being practical, in that one of the things I can do with my museum and my collection is get old floppy disks and get old zip disks and things like that from folks, read their files, copy them to modern systems, and then convert them from MacWrite or Word 3 or what have you to something modern. And I wind up, that's the software I sort of look for and collect because it's useful to me, and also getting to see how things work. So kind of geeky, not really gamey or things like that, but the operating system and the productivity apps would be the long answer to your short question.
I think there's going to be more and more call for that, too. I mean, as time goes on, even more call for conversion. People having sat on old data for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's growing steadily. It's something. It's work which originally found me, as people knew I had the old equipment and said, hey, can you read this? And after I did some of it, I made it an official service and started writing about it and, marketing it. And it has been sort of slowly but steadily growing over time, and I completely agree. In fact, I wrote a column on my blog recently saying that CDs and DVDs are soon going to be vintage media. 5 years ago, you won't be able to buy a computer with a drive, and you'll just need someone who can read the thing.
I'd like to focus a bit, my question, on going back to the personal view. And if you look back on sort of the fairly large breadth of different sorts of computers that Apple put out for the Macintosh, between the 68K and the PowerPC lines and the various PowerBooks and stuff, and lots of them are among everybody's favorites, like the SE30 and the LC475 are two of my favorites. But for you, what would you think is maybe one of Apple's biggest missteps, or one of the like a computer they put out in that area where you kind of scratch your head and wonder, well, why would they make that?
That's actually an easier question than you realize.
The
entire Performa line.
Can you tell them apart?
Can you tell the performers apart?
Yeah, I found I would often get confused of which is which with the various numbering.
That's the problem. It's exactly the problem. The Performas, so the LCs and the small pizza box type systems, they made in a whole bunch of different variants with the same system, or very, very similar system, with slightly different model numbers, so they could sell them in through different retailers. And they were all crippled. They had not enough RAM or not enough cache memory, or because they were lower cost. They were trying to save money on them. But they were always, with a few exceptions, they were dogs. And you couldn't tell them apart, and it was really confusing. And I've refused to even add those to the collection because I think it's just one of those areas where Apple had lost focus and was trying to be all things to all people. And it was nice when they trimmed those out before Steve Jobs got back. But that was the kind of thing that really exemplified how they were going in the wrong direction.
I was an Apple tech in the field, during that time. And yeah, it was crazy. You had Office Depot selling them, and Best Buy, Sears, and those were I'm sure there's a few other places. That was primarily where the Performas were. And so you had like 61 12s and 15s and just all kinds of crazy different variations. My first color Mac was a Performa. I bought at Sears. So it was a Performa 400, which was nothing more than an LC2. But it came with, bundled apps. So that's where I got started with ClarisWorks 1.0, which was great, from that standpoint.
And I'm gonna interject there because that reminds me of something I hadn't thought about in a while. The one thing the Performers had going for them, and you also got the same thing for a long time on the iMacs versus the professional machines. You'd buy the consumer machines, the Performers or the cheap iMac, and you get all this bundled stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd pony up several grand more for the Power Mac or something like that, and you wouldn't get any of that stuff.
Right.
Apple has changed that. I mean, now you get everything in all the machines, but that was really annoying for a while.
Yeah, I agree. It's sort of unfair. Like I always thought when AppleWorks came out, they should have just went ahead and included that on everything. So before iWork and such.
Yep.
So Adam, are you interested in or do you collect any other vintage computers? So do you have any particular interest in anything non-Apple or that you collect or have a story to?
It's funny you should mention that timing-wise because for the most part I haven't been collecting non-Apple really for the sake of just not letting things get out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
And not having enough room for what I have. But part maybe thinking of this podcast, but just looking over some recent Craigslist ads, I have made some inquiries just within the past few days on several systems. One is an original IBM PC. One is a Radio Shack TRS-80 Model 3, the famous all-in-one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I remember programming on that when I was in high school. And another guy has 3 portables. He has an original Osborne 1 with the 5-inch screen.
Oh, cool.
A K-Pro 2, and an original compact.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well, they all...
You're in dangerous waters.
They don't have operating systems. They all turn on. And I'm like, well, this could be interesting just to have them as period pieces and to compare them, with what was going on in Apple's world at the time. It gives me thoughts of expanding the collection, beyond what I have, and then I have to counter that with where the hell am I going to put all this stuff?
Yeah, right.
But if you ask me again in a few weeks, so that's 5 machines. I might have, 1 or 2 working ones of them if I acquire any of them. So we'll see what happens.
You've been bitten.
Oh, I have far more offered to me than I can accept. I've kept it to Mac, and I've kept it to 68K PowerPC only really to keep it bounded.
Right. And from my perspective, where I was a fairly large collector for a long time, I've had to make tough decisions and narrow it down and, thin it out and stuff over the years. So I have some specific Macs that basically I focus on. And really, a lot of times they're ones that I had hands-on experience or I liked. It's funny, like you mentioned about the Performa. So for me, because I worked on Performas during my time as an Apple tech in the field, so I agree with all the negatives about them, but of course they were the ones I spent a lot of time working on. So right. They're nostalgic for me having, supported them and such. So I have a couple of those.
There's nothing wrong with that. It's totally personal. It's totally subjective. The interesting thing to me is that this brand, because folks like us, we're interested in technology. And we're interested in these different computers, and you understand why the models I just mentioned are interesting in the history of technology. Most people don't have that type of fondness for them as a whole. But Apple and the Mac as a brand, has engendered so many memories and so much attachment. That's part of what it's about. And, people seeing my equipment and people, when I can do the services for them, It just, very few other people have a collection of just one brand of this extent, and yet I'm one of many people who do it for the Mac.
Right.
And that really has to tell you something about what this object is and what this ecosystem is.
Good point. If I recall, your museum is a working museum. Is that right? Like all of everything you've got there is actually fully functional.
I would say it's probably at about 85% at any given time, but yes, that's correct.
You kind of never know, do you, until the next time you turn everything on again?
Nope. And
that's what I mean. Is the pieces, they're not just there as physical objects. I mean, and that's something I think that differentiates collecting computers and vintage computers from collecting a lot of other things is there is more time involved in upkeep and that kind of stuff. If you collect postage stamps, then you just stick them under glass and you're done. And if you collect computers or want a museum like this, I mean, I can see why you'd be hesitant about bringing in additional systems or branching outside of the wheelhouse of the Mac, because it does take time to track down operating systems that are appropriate for them and get everything installed and make sure everything's running.
And keep spares. The way you keep a collection of 10 to 30-year-old technology around is to have several of each one. So when parts fail, you can substitute in things that are no longer manufactured. And I have to tell that to people who say, can you help me rebuild my Mac 2 something because I'm using it for my business? And I'm like, you really don't want to be doing this. Forget about your personal reasons. So it's a working collection, and the back room is the 2 or 3 or 4 of each model that I have broken down in parts, especially for the ones I use regularly, so I can keep the things running. That's absolutely part of it.
Which takes up a lot of space to have all this extra Macs in.
I bought a house I live alone, and I have a 3-bedroom house with an attic and a basement.
That is commitment.
You sound like you're on the way to be a true collector.
Or
I'm on my way. I think I've hit that hurdle already.
Yeah.
Hit and cross.
You've got no worries.
And so
all right, guys.
What's the plan going forward? Like, roughly for the collection and for you personally, what can we look forward? Are you looking to expand? Are you going to bring in more models? Are you going to open another museum? Are writing plans? Sort of in general.
I'm doing some writing. I'm doing less for Cultimac than I used to, just because my business has gotten very busy this year. So that's something that I try to do just as a side thing. The collection, my plan for the collection is severalfold. One is I'd ultimately like to have a place where it can be open to the public, at least part-time, so that folks can see it and interact with it a bit. I could want to continue to expand the services I'm offering in terms of file transfers and conversions. And something I've gotten involved in recently, and it's also been in the news recently, is prior art for patent cases, such as Apple, Samsung, or other things. I mean, patent cases go back decades. And I am working with some folks who regularly need copies of hardware or software that Apple themselves don't have anymore. So I have found this to be a very interesting little niche where the more to this technology I keep running, the more it becomes relevant to people who can't find it anymore and need it for some reference. So as a resource for that area and for transfers, and also as something that's of interest to people, it will have a greater presence. I'm not sure exactly how and when, but it's evolved a life of its own, and that's something that is worth continuing to guide.
Nice.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
We enjoyed it.
A lot, Adam.
We hope we can talk to you again soon.